August 3, 1943. Noon. Oklahoma sun bleaches the air to a pale, white heat. On the edge of a vast army compound near Fort Sill, 200 Japanese prisoners are marched in single file. Their uniforms are faded and patched. Their faces are drawn from heat and disbelief. They had braced for punishment, for whips, chains, starvation. That's what the leaflets had warned. That's what the officers had said before they'd surrendered. But then the column halts. There's a low metallic clink, repeated steady, a rhythm out of place in the dusty wind. One of the prisoners flinches. Another squints into the distance, blinking past the glare. What they see stops them cold. At a row of long wooden tables under canvas shade, other Japanese prisoners, fellow soldiers, are seated calmly in a neat line. They wear crisp, clean work shirts. They're holding paper slips and talking with an American sergeant in a pressed uniform. The clink is the sound of typewriter keys. Behind the sergeant is a ledger book, a table with coins. One prisoner stands, bows lightly, and walks away holding something in his hand. It's not food, it's money. U.S. military-printed currency. They're being paid. That's when Corporal Aoki speaks, aloud the thought none of them dared whisper. They're paying prisoners to work. No one answers. Because until that moment, none of them had believed such a thing was possible. They had come from the Pacific in silence, boxcars through Arizona and New Mexico, always surrounded by GIs with M1 rifles, always eyes forward, heads down. The journey from surrender to prison had been a blur of train smoke, heatstroke, and shame. For men raised on Bushido, the shame was heavier than any wound. They were not supposed to be alive. They were not supposed to have surrendered. And now, instead of camps of barbed wire and beatings, they were standing in a place where the Americans handed them currency for labor. It broke every expectation, every rule. That night in the barracks lit by electric bulbs, the whispers started. They treat us like workers. I saw one eat beside a guard. I was told they'll let you save the money. Staff Sergeant Fujita sat in the corner and said nothing. His silence held more weight than any rumor. He had been in Manchukuo. He had seen what Japanese prison camps did to Chinese and Russian captives. He had seen frostbite used as punishment, deliberate starvation, execution for defiance. Now he had watched a guard offer a POW a cigarette. Fujita stared at the slip of paper on his bunk, a work assignment, agricultural labor, accompanied by a typed rate, 10 cents per hour. Is it real? One younger soldier asked him. Fujita didn't answer. But the next morning, when the guards called names, he stood up and joined the work line. The trucks rolled out before sunrise. In the dust behind them, hay bales, fence posts, irrigation lines. The labor wasn't easy, but it wasn't punishment either. It was field work, farm work, supervised by old men from the U.S. Department of Agriculture and local civilians, all wearing wide hats and chewing tobacco. The prisoners moved in silence, but the strangeness of it lingered. No insults, no slaps, no rifles pointed at their backs. At midday, the work stopped. Sandwiches were passed out. 2 American guards joked with each other in slow, friendly tones. One even said thank you to a POW who helped unload a barrel. By day's end, each man returned to camp with another slip of paper, work credit. It meant nothing to them yet, but it was beginning to. The first prisoner to ask about using his credit was a cook named Imai. His request was simple: soap. He hadn't bathed properly in weeks. The sergeant manning the commissary window blinked. Sure, he said, and pointed to a shelf of labeled items: soap, toothpaste, writing paper, even candy bars. Imai paid with the camp-issued scrip, and the sergeant gave him back change. When he returned to the barracks, he said one word: real. That night, over steaming bowls of boiled rice and beans, The mood shifted. Men began to talk openly. They asked what else could be bought. They debated saving the credits. Some imagined sending it home. Others dismissed the idea. Fujita listened, quiet as ever, but this time he wasn't staring at the floor. He was watching the guards. One had set a cup of coffee on a stool, forgotten it, and gone off to inspect a fence post. Another guard had let two prisoners handle the firewood pile themselves. It was not carelessness, it was trust. Or something like it. 2 weeks later, the first mail came. Letters from the International Red Cross, translated carefully, some from families in Tokyo, others from wives in Yokohama or Sapporo. Many were filled with grief, with confusion, but one line repeated in multiple letters stunned even the most hardened officers. "We heard you were safe. We heard the Americans are not cruel. They say you can work." Some of the men cried silently that night. Others refused to believe it. But the next morning, the work lines were fuller than ever. By October, the prisoners were organizing rotating duty rosters themselves. They elected leaders. They suggested improvements to tools. One even offered to help maintain the camp's small garden. When guards noticed the discipline, they passed word up the chain. The War Department issued a formal memo. Morale among Japanese POWs in Western labor camps remains stable and increasingly cooperative. Prisoners respond well to structured labor and limited personal economy. The Japanese prisoners didn't know this. They only knew that something unthinkable had happened. They were working, they were being paid, they were writing letters, they were somehow still men. And for men who expected to be treated as dogs, this fact was more disorienting than captivity itself. In December, a small newspaper arrived in the camp. A weekly bulletin, printed in Japanese, distributed to all POW camps. It included news of the war, heavily censored, but honest enough to admit setbacks. It also contained something else. A list of names, promotions, commendations, camp competitions. One name stood out. Corporal Aoki, commended for saving a fellow prisoner from injury on a work site. When Aoki read his name in print, he sat down and whispered, "They let us be seen." It was the first time in months he had said anything more than 3 words at once. Fujita spoke at last on New Year's Day. He gathered the youngest soldiers, barely 20 all of them. He stood with his back to the flagpole, stared at the horizon. When a man expects to die in lives, his shame is total, but what happens next defines him. We were prepared to be animals in their eyes, but they did not treat us like animals. One asked him, "Then what are we now?" Fujita didn't answer. But that afternoon, when the work lines formed, he was the first one to step forward. The sound of the bugle in the Oklahoma morning didn't carry the harsh bark of command the prisoners had grown used to in the Pacific. It wasn't an alarm. It was a rhythm, like a signal of ordinary routine, not discipline enforced by violence, but a schedule everyone already knew. By February, the men had begun to walk to work detail without needing orders shouted at them. They folded their own bedding. They lined up in silence, not from fear, but from habit. The guards barely raised their voices. New arrivals to the camp, prisoners shipped from Saipan and Kwajalein, arrived gaunt and stone-eyed. Many refused food the first night. Some refused to speak. Staff Sergeant Fujita watched them from the corner of the mess hall. He saw their trembling hands, their sunken cheeks, the flicker of hatred in their eyes as they glanced at the guards or at other Japanese soldiers laughing softly over food trays. He understood it. That had been him once. But he also knew what would come next. The moment when hunger overcame pride, when they accepted the tray of rice and beans, when they realized that no one here was going to kill them for looking a guard in the eye. The camp wasn't paradise, but it wasn't a prison in the way they had imagined. And the most astonishing part, the part that left even Fujita unsure whether it was clever or monstrous, was the economy. A system designed to make prisoners more than captives. Every prisoner was paid 10 cents an hour. Each day of labor, farm work, maintenance, latrine duty, even tending gardens, meant another set of credits added to a personal ledger. The money couldn't be spent outside the wire, but inside the camp it flowed like currency. There were camp script notes, stamped with for use only at war prisoner camp. They could be traded at the commissary for toothpaste, pencils, socks, tobacco, candy, writing paper, even radios for group barracks. There were ledgers, typed by American clerks, tracking individual earnings. There was a posted bulletin listing prices. To men who had spent their entire military service under rations, often unpaid, often bartering for soap or boots, the effect was profound. They began to keep records, to budget, to save. Some began sending letters home requesting approval to write to banks in Japan. Others asked about savings accounts or future transfer of wages. They weren't just surviving, they were planning. And in a camp built by the same nation that had incinerated their destroyers and bombed their cities, this fact left men speechless. The guards noticed the shift. Sergeant First Class Mark Delaney, who had rotated through both German and Japanese POW camps, commented in a report, "Japanese prisoners exhibit extremely structured internal behavior. They take their work seriously and rarely complain. Their acceptance of the pay-for-labor program is higher than expected. Camp economy functioning smoothly." He was being modest. In Block C3, prisoners had drawn up their own inventory of labor hours. In B2, they began pooling their earnings to purchase bulk paper and writing instruments to begin a literary club. In A1, they made a rotating fund to purchase luxuries for those who worked the hardest jobs: firewood, hauling, latrines. The Americans had introduced a structure, and the Japanese had filled it with order. One day, a new request appeared. A senior officer named Lieutenant Commander Sugiura, once a destroyer captain, submitted a formal inquiry. Could prisoners be permitted to keep a small library of Japanese books if they used work earnings to pay for Red Cross shipment and translation approval? The request went up the chain. It reached the War Department and was approved. That month a parcel arrived. Japanese language texts, mostly classical literature and technical manuals, donated by Red Cross affiliates. Inside Barracks B4, the first prisoner-operated library opened. A sign was painted carefully on a plank of pine board, "Knowledge before victory." Fujita saw it and stood silent for a long time. He wondered who the victory was for. The longer the prisoners lived within the system, the more clearly they understood that the American intent wasn't simply to house them. It was to break the cycle of hatred, not with pity, but with structure. Each rule was a message, each schedule, each paycheck, each letter home. You are not animals, you are not forgotten. You are part of something now. Even if that something was a war machine that had destroyed their fleets and sunk their carriers. Even if that paycheck was earned on fields growing food for the same army that was firebombing Tokyo. The contradiction was unbearable and unignorable. There were incidents, not all prisoners accepted it. One older officer from Burma refused to accept wages. He would not work. He would not spend. He declared himself spiritually dead and fasted for 4 days before guards intervened. Others refused only specific jobs, anything that resembled servitude, especially cleaning latrines. Fujita was called in once to speak to a young prisoner who had torn up his script after being asked to clean a water trough. He sat beside the boy, both of them staring at the earth. "You don't have to be grateful," Fujita said. "You don't have to forget." "Then why do it?" the boy snapped. Because starving with dignity is still starving, Fujita said. And because someday you'll return home. What will you tell them that you refused a chance to send food money to your sister? The boy said nothing for a long time. Then he picked up the script. The guards never spoke Japanese, but they knew tone. They noticed when the tension eased, when the prisoners no longer avoided eye contact, when yes came faster than silence. Some guards even began learning a few phrases. One day, a guard from Arkansas who had been raised by a Japanese mother in San Francisco asked if he could teach a few English words to any prisoner who wanted to learn. 16 volunteered the first day. By the end of the month, they were using their script to buy English-Japanese dictionaries from the Red Cross catalog. It was not kindness. It was quiet transformation. By summer of 1944, the camp's economy ran on its own rhythm. Earnings were calculated, supplies ordered, block leaders managed inventory. Some prisoners took pride in it, a kind of parallel military, not one that fought but one that functioned. They had not chosen it, but they had mastered it. And that, more than anything, began to haunt the officers. Because if they could live like this, learn like this, under American control, what had they truly been fighting for? The question became unavoidable. Fujita felt it most when the radio was turned on, the one in the shared mess, played once a week with American approval. Sometimes it played American news, sometimes music. One day it played a message from Tokyo. War update, official broadcast. It was clipped, official, brittle. The enemy collapses, our spirit is strong, the Americans are weak and tired. Fujita looked around the room. The POWs were eating balanced meals, working paid jobs, listening to news while studying English and learning agriculture. The Americans were not collapsing. And they were not weak. By fall, Fujita was receiving letters from his sister in Sapporo. She had learned he was alive. She thanked the Americans. She had used the money he sent through Red Cross channels to buy food. He read the letter 4 times before folding it. Then he walked outside, sat on a bench, and stared out past the wire, past the Oklahoma prairie, toward a sky that never changed. He realized that somewhere along the line, he had stopped counting the days. He was still a prisoner, but not like before. Not in the way he had feared. And not in the way he had deserved. By winter of 1944, the wind across the Oklahoma plains grew sharp and dry, cutting through the cracks in the wooden barracks. The guards brought in extra wool blankets, more coal and thicker work gloves. Inside the Japanese POW camp, the air was filled with new sounds. Not arguments, not commands, but the tap-tap-tap of pencil on paper, the rustle of letters, the low murmur of translation. In the corner of Block C3, 3 prisoners gathered around a single typewriter, rented with pooled script and approved by the camp commandant. They were working on a bilingual dictionary, hand-typed in parallel columns. Japanese, English, Romanized pronunciation. Across the yard, 2 others pored over diagrams for a windmill built from scrap materials. It would, if approved, help power the barracks' lights. Fujita watched all of it from his usual place by the doorframe, coat wrapped tightly around his shoulders. He was no longer feared in the way he had once been. Men still respected him, but they no longer sought permission. They were changing, all of them, and so was he. The system had become more than routine. The earning of money, once a surreal novelty, was now part of their lives. Work credits came in envelopes just like wages. Ledgers were kept with obsessive accuracy. What had started as labor for survival had become something more dangerous, something more humanizing. Dignity. And that was the part none of them could explain when they wrote home. In January, a new initiative arrived, a camp-wide contest. Each barracks would compete to design a better sanitation system, to be implemented in the spring. The winning team would receive extra work credits, plus first pick at the next Red Cross shipment. It was meant as motivation, but it triggered something no one expected. Every block responded, blueprints were sketched, teams formed, supply lists were compiled. A former engineering student in Barracks A4 drew up a full gravity-fed filtration system. Another prisoner proposed building a proper shower stall using salvaged wood and concrete. Within weeks, they weren't just submitting plans, they were negotiating supply routes, managing shared labor, scheduling rotations. The guards watched in disbelief. One lieutenant remarked, "It's like they've turned the camp into a university." He wasn't far off. The winning design, a two-stage water system using hand-cranked pressure and charcoal filtering, was implemented in April. After the first successful test, the team was photographed by camp staff. The prisoners stood in front of their construction, arms crossed, half smiles visible. The photo was published in a War Department newsletter. A small caption read, "Japanese POWs in Fort Sill build water system, receive labor credits." Back in the camp, the men pinned it to the mess hall bulletin board. They said nothing about it, but every man walked past and looked at it at least once. Not out of vanity, but because it was proof that they were more than broken swords. As the months passed, the rumors of war's turning began to feel more like certainty. News filtered in. American forces retook the Philippines. B-29 bombers were now striking Japanese cities. Tokyo had been hit. One day, a Red Cross translator read aloud a message from a broadcast intercepted in Japan. The word firebombing was mentioned. No one spoke for a long time after. The economic system inside the camp did not stop, but the weight it carried changed. Scrip began to be saved more, fewer luxuries purchased, more letters sent home with small donations included. Some men asked to be reassigned to heavier labor. Others began teaching basic English to newcomers, unpaid after hours. Fujita began keeping a journal, not for himself, but in case he died before the war ended. He wanted someone to know what happened here. In late May, something unexpected arrived. A package addressed to Barracks B3. Inside, a hand-stitched kimono, a letter, a black and white photo of a woman and child. The note read, "Your money helped me buy medicine for our son. He is well, thank you. We wait for you." The recipient, a quiet man named Sakurai, didn't cry. He folded the kimono neatly. He didn't speak for hours, but he stood straighter than he had in weeks. The letter circulated quietly, hand to hand. For many, it was the first tangible proof that the credits earned in this strange American system had made it all the way back to Japan. That their labor had not been for nothing. The work days continued. The camp store expanded. More Red Cross shipments arrived. The library held over 200 Japanese-language books. An American chaplain began offering to teach basic arithmetic to interested prisoners. 12 showed up the first week, 20 by the third. They used camp script to buy slates, chalk, and pads of paper. In Block A2, one man began compiling a guidebook, How to Write to a Foreigner. It listed polite phrases, idioms, cultural references. He said it was for after the war, so that they would know how to speak if they were ever allowed to live abroad. But not everyone adjusted. There were still fights, still moments of rage. One evening, a former Imperial Navy officer tore down the bulletin board, shouting that everyone had become American pets. He was removed quietly, placed under observation. But he had voiced what others still felt, a tension that never disappeared. This was not normal, this was not honorable. But it was real. And it was what survival looked like. In July, a new policy was tested. Selected prisoners would be allowed to teach their skills to American staff, instructors. Fujita was one of the first chosen. He was to assist in training military personnel in basic Japanese vocabulary. The idea was controversial. Many refused. But Fujita accepted. He sat in a small tent outside the wire, 2 hours a day, 3 days a week, working through pronunciation drills and sentence patterns with young Americans barely out of high school. He taught with the same precision he had once drilled recruits. He wrote in his journal afterward, "I am teaching the language of the men who kill our cities, but I am not angry. I am uncertain." By early August 1945, the guards were nervous. News from Europe had been swift: Hitler dead, Germany surrendered. But in the Pacific, the war's crescendo had come with fire. Tokyo was nearly gone. Hiroshima had been bombed. No one knew how. The camp's radio had been quiet for hours. Then the news came: Nagasaki. The guards didn't tell the prisoners right away. But they didn't need to. Fujita knew. He saw it in the face of the officer who always nodded politely at him in the mornings. The man's hands were shaking. On August 15th, the prisoners were gathered in the mess hall. A translator from Washington read a prepared statement. The war was over. The emperor had spoken. Japan had surrendered. No one moved, no one clapped. For the first time in 3 years, there was no sound. Then a single man stood, Sakurai. He bowed once deeply and walked out. The morning after Japan's surrender was announced, the camp stood in perfect silence. The wind blew across the fields. The sun rose the same way it always did. But the air carried weight now, the weight of something unspoken pressing against every man's chest. No work detail was called that day, no bugle, no roll call. The guards moved slowly, keeping their distance. Inside the barracks, the prisoners sat, stared, wrote nothing. Meals were left uneaten. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Fujita didn't sleep that night. Neither did most of the others. Some lay on their bunks, staring at the rafters. Others walked small, tight circles in the yard. One man from Block B simply sat outside for 9 hours, staring at a clump of dry grass. It wasn't anger, it wasn't grief. It was something harder to name. A kind of dislocation. For over 3 years, they had lived in a war that had always continued elsewhere. Battles fought across oceans, cities bombed from the sky, orders delivered from distant voices none of them ever heard. Now the war was done, and they had outlived it. Fujita had seen battlefields littered with the dead. He had stood on the decks of destroyers in Shanghai. He had watched entire regiments vanish in the Philippines. And yet this felt like the worst loss of all. Because it was not just an army that had surrendered. It was everything they were told they were. In the days that followed, the camp commandant issued a new policy. Work details would be suspended until further notice. Prisoners would remain in the camp, but without structured labor. The economy paused. The script remained valid, but few used it. They had earned money in a system that now no longer had a purpose. The field sat empty. The library closed for 2 days. And then slowly, without being asked, the men began to return to routine. They resumed cleaning. Water was hauled, books were reshelved. A list appeared, written in ink and pinned to the barracks wall. Camp Journal Project. Volunteers needed for the history of our time here. No order, no command. Just something to build again. Fujita's first journal entry after the surrender was only 7 words. I do not know what we are now. That same night, he sat outside alone and tried to write a letter to his sister. He began the letter 5 times. Only on the sixth try did he complete a single paragraph. I am alive. I was not tortured. I was not shamed. I was paid to work. I helped build a water system. I taught English to American soldiers. I am sorry. The pen stopped moving after that. He folded the page and stared into the darkness. Repatriation procedures began in mid-September. One by one, barracks were summoned to hear the instructions. Japanese prisoners would be sent home in organized waves. Transport trains to the coast, ships under Red Cross authority. They would receive copies of their work earnings for official record. A small packet of scrip, now ceremonial more than practical, would be included in their belongings. Fujita watched as one young soldier folded his camp work ledger into his uniform with careful hands, smoothing it flat like a sacred document. Another kept only one item, a bar of soap still wrapped, marked property of U.S. Army. He said he wanted his mother to see it. That things like this were given, not stolen. As the weeks passed, the tone changed again. Letters from Japan spoke of ruin, cities flattened, rice rations down to ounces, thousands starving. One man received news that his father, a colonel, had taken his own life the day after the surrender. Another learned his home in Yokohama no longer existed. Some asked to delay repatriation. They said it was because they hoped to see friends before leaving. But Fujita knew the truth. They were afraid to return. Afraid of what waited. Afraid of being asked to explain how they had survived and why they had been allowed to. Fujita was assigned to the second repatriation group, October 21st. In the week leading up to departure, he walked the camp alone. He visited every building, touched the walls of every barracks, stood for an hour at the edge of the work field where he had once hauled logs beside men who were now scattered to other camps or dead. He wrote again in his journal, I do not know what I will tell them. I do not know if I will be believed, but I will tell them we were fed, we were paid, and in some impossible way we were treated like men. The night before his departure, the guards held a quiet ceremony. No speeches, no flags, just coffee and donuts set out on folding tables and a gramophone playing American jazz. The prisoners gathered slowly, confused, then cautiously. Then in silence they ate. One guard raised a paper cup in salute. Fujita returned the gesture. In the darkness before dawn, the trucks came. Barracks C and D were the first to go. Men stood in line, personal belongings in bags, hats in hand. No chains, no shouting. Only names called, and then movement. When it was Fujita's turn, he stepped forward. The American sergeant checking names paused, looked him in the eye, then handed him a sealed envelope. Inside, his work credit summary, a certificate of cooperation, a typed note, thank you for your service in maintaining order, you were respected. Fujita stood for a long moment before nodding. Then he boarded the truck. They drove in silence, through the Oklahoma plains, through towns just waking up. People stared as the convoy passed, some waved, some didn't. At the train station, Red Cross staff handed out boxed meals, rice, boiled eggs, bread. Fujita took his and ate slowly. He didn't look at the others. When the train began to move, he turned once to look out the window. The camp was gone, only flat land behind them, and a sky that stretched out in every direction, endless and gray. The sea was gray when they arrived, not storming, just heavy, indifferent. The ship that carried them home creaked at the edges, a Red Cross flag painted along the hull, the cabins cold and quiet. No military band greeted them. No family stood at the docks. Fujita stepped onto Japanese soil on a Tuesday morning in late November. No one said welcome. No one saluted. The port officials barely looked at them as they processed names and stamps. There were no parades for prisoners. Only forms. And silence. The streets of Yokohama were unrecognizable. Ash and concrete, half-burned walls, children barefoot in alleys, a temple split in two by a steel beam. Fujita walked with a small bag over his shoulder, a Red Cross issue, containing one set of clothes, a certificate of honorable repatriation, and a slip of paper confirming the amount he had earned during his time as a laborer. $324. He folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope. It didn't matter if it spent. It mattered that it had been real. In Sapporo, his sister met him at the train platform. She wore a coat too thin for the snow, and a scarf she had darned so many times the threads barely held. She didn't run to him. She bowed once, then touched his sleeve. He bowed back. Neither of them cried. That night she made rice. One egg split between them. He offered to use some of the money, but she shook her head. You already gave enough. Then she brought out a folded cloth from the drawer. Inside it, the camp currency, crisp, unfaded, protected. You sent this, she said. I didn't exchange it. I wanted it to stay untouched. Fujita stared at the small printed words in English. He turned the note in his hands, then set it down. They paid me every hour I worked, he said. She asked nothing, but her hands trembled slightly as she took the note back. He tried to find work. At first people turned him away politely, then less politely. They knew he had been a POW, that he had lived. A shopkeeper whispered behind his back, he probably sang for the Americans. Another muttered, he comes home fat while my brother never came home at all. He didn't argue. He simply stopped speaking about where he had been. In the months that followed, he taught school, basic arithmetic and reading. He never wore a uniform again. He kept the camp script in a small envelope tucked inside a drawer of his desk. Sometimes he would take it out and stare at it under the lamplight. It wasn't nostalgia. It was memory. Proof of a life that didn't fit the stories people told. Proof that even in defeat, there had been dignity. Other men came home too, quietly, without parades. Some found wives had remarried, others found nothing at all. One wrote to Fujita from Osaka. He asked, "Do you still have the soap?" Fujita wrote back, "I kept the money, that was enough." In 1952, when the occupation formally ended, Fujita returned to work one morning to find a letter waiting on his desk. It was from the United States. The envelope bore a Department of Veterans Affairs return address. Inside, a photograph. A young American soldier standing beside a row of Japanese prisoners, all holding work slips, all smiling. On the back, written in careful penmanship, "You taught me to say thank you in Japanese. I never forgot that. I hope you are well." No name. Just a memory. Fujita pinned the photograph inside the back cover of his journal. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't need to. In his final journal entry, dated October 12, 1973, he wrote, "They feared we would become dogs in cages. Instead, we were paid to stand upright. They did not have to do that, but they did. I still don't understand why." He signed it, folded it, closed the book, and left it on the desk, beside a small envelope filled with paper currency that could no longer be spent. But never once in all those years had he thrown it away. Because money had never meant survival before. And in that place, that strange, impossible place, it had meant something more than survival. It had meant that the war had ended long before they were told. And that somehow dignity had survived it.